Hi, in this lecture we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 1. If you haven't read the first chapter of Genesis, then pause this video and read the text, as we're going to move through it rather rapidly. Now, the first thing we should take notice of is that we actually have two stories of creation in Genesis. The first story is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a, that is the first half of verse 4. The second story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, begins in chapter 2, verse 4b and runs through chapter 3, verse 24. The chapter and verse numbers were added to the Bible in the Middle Ages, and since the medieval scholars of that day did not quite see where the seams were between the stories, they sometimes chopped up the text in ways that we would not do today. And this situation exists here in Genesis. While the medieval scholars read these two creation stories as one narrative, we can see today, by the use of different vocabulary, different writing styles, different theologies, that these were originally two separate stories that were placed side by side in the book of Genesis when it was compiled and edited over numerous years. So the first point we should make is that we should not assume that every biblical book was written by a single author. In fact, that's more the exception than the rule. But rather, these documents were added to, supplemented, and modified, sometimes over decades, if not even centuries, by faith communities. So modern biblical scholarship would say that we have two distinct creation stories in Genesis. Now, often these stories here in Genesis 1 to 3 are taken literally, that is, they're read factually, as historical fact or scientific fact. As Catholic Christians, we don't read the texts literally, as we've talked about already, but rather contextually. And we know that the point of these creation stories is not to describe how God scientifically created the world, but to illustrate the meaning of the world that we live in. Now, that said, I do think that this story that we find here in Genesis 1 was written with a desire to give an account of creation that had some realism to it, to describe the world around us in a realistic way. But that does not mean it was scientific history, as should become clear as we proceed. So, when I read Genesis 1, I must admit that I find it rather redundant and even boring. When it's proclaimed at Easter Vigil, I sometimes struggle to keep my eyes open because it's so repetitive. If you notice, every single day is the same. Every day has the same fourfold pattern. That pattern is, number one, the day is introduced with the words, and God said, let it be whatever. And, whatever God's about to do. Create the light, the dome, under the waters, the sun, the animals, etc. The second step is, and then the accomplishment of that act of creation is confirmed with the words, and then it was so. The next step is that it says that God said that it was good. And we should notice here that the word for good in Hebrew is tov. And that doesn't refer to moral goodness. Rather, it means it works. It's sufficient. It does what it should do. That's the meaning of good here in this text. So good's a way of describing that it works properly. And the fourth final aspect of this pattern is that every day closes with the words, and it was evening, and then it was morning, the whatever day. This fourfold pattern repeats itself over and over again through 6 days, and is only broken when the seventh day God takes a rest. Now, why does the author use this repetitive pattern? Was it because he's not very creative? Not a very good writer? Well, of course not. That order itself has a purpose. To understand that purpose, we have to look at the historical context and cultural context in which the story was written. Interestingly, this first story in the Bible is not the oldest story we have in the Bible. In fact, it's, one of the more newer stories in some ways, because it comes from the time of the Babylonian exile. If you take a look at the wall of Israelite history, you'll see that the Babylonian exile happens really quite late in the history of the people of Israel and Judah. It's here in the third to the last quadrant of our wall of Israelite history that we've seen before. The year 587, 586, the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem and they send their leaders into exile in Babylon, which today we call Iraq, the southern part of Iraq. The Babylonians forcefully marched the religious leaders to the... so here's our map. We can see, so you take basically here from Israel, marching the political, religious, and economic leaders, and you march them off here into Babylon. Why do you do that? Well, number one, you've now brought the intellectual capital, and also because you have tradesmen and what have you, all the skilled laborers, you've brought that into your economy. That beefs up your economy. But more importantly, it also allows you to keep an eye on these exiled leaders to make sure they don't cause you any problems by separating them from their people. In addition, you can put your own people in charge now back in the land of Israel, and those folks who are in charge are beholden to the power of the Babylonians, so they're willing to, if they don't maintain the Babylonians' rule, then they will lose power. So it's a very common practice. It still exists today. You could even make the argument that this is somewhat what we did when we took the Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders during the war in Afghanistan and sent them to Guantanamo Bay. So here, though, the Jews are sitting in Babylon, in exile. And what do they hear? Well, they hear the story of creation as told by the Babylonians, the Babylonian creation myth. And what's that story? Well, we know that story because it still exists. You can pick it up in the library if you want. We uncovered the tablets of what's called the Enuma Elish, their creation story. You can see here on the slide these texts. In fact, here's the blow-up of one of the texts. You can see the cuneiform writing, use of a stick, with diamond-shaped stick that you impress within the wet clay. Those different markings represent different words. Okay, so what does this Babylonian story, the Enuma Elish, say? What's the details? Well, once upon a time there was a husband and wife, and I'm going to give you the more dramatic reading of this story. I'll take some liberties with it, but the basic outline is as follows. So you have Apsu, who was the god of fresh waters, the lakes and the streams. And then you have Tiamat, his wife, and she's the goddess of the salt water, the sea, and which always represented chaos. So they have a bunch of kids. One day, Apsu turns to his wife, Tiamat, and says, "Why do we have to have all these kids? Life was a lot happier when we were all alone. I've got an idea. Let's kill the kids." A rather shocking solution. Well, one of the offsprings, E, overhears this, and he runs to the other kid and says, "Oh my gosh, Dad's going to kill us." Now, Tiamat, in the meantime, has resisted Apsu's plans and talked him out of it, but the kids don't know that. So the children get together, they conspire, and they kill Apsu. Freud would have a heyday with this story. Well, that throws Tiamat into an absolute rage. So she goes and to one of the other brothers, her favorite, and says, "Join forces with me, King Zhu, and we're going to go kill your brothers and sisters." Well, the brothers and sisters are horrified, and so they approach the strongest of them, and they name Marduk, and he's the storm god. He controls lightning and the rain. And so Tiamat and Marduk get into this epic battle. And here we see an example of this is a cylinder seal. So it's a little round object that you can roll across clay, and it leaves behind this marking here. And then you can see over at the... I'm muting my... Over on the other side is a bas relief from a palace of this same battle. Here we have Marduk and then also Tiamat. Okay, so what happens here in the battle between Tiamat and Marduk? Well, as Tiamat approaches Marduk, he's got this plan. He hides the wind behind his back. Remember, he's the storm god. And when Tiamat opens up her mouth to swallow up Marduk, he throws the wind into her mouth. She blows up like a balloon, and then Marduk strikes her with a thunderbolt. Boom! And she pops and spews in a million pieces. You know, ding dong, the evil witch is dead. But now the kid's got a problem. They have all these pieces of God laying around, and they're going to rot and start to stink. So they take Tiamat's body and they make a dome above and the earth below and the features of the world out of her body. And they take King Ju, who they've killed too, their brother, and they take the blood from him and they put it within this creature they made called humans and make that his blood and make that those human slaves for them to serve them as gods. Now, think about that story. What is it saying? It's saying that the world we live in is one of chaos because we're made out of chaos. No wonder the world's so discouraging, dreadful, unpleasant, evil, and fearful. The world itself is an accidental consequence of a family feud made by gods who are unable to control their unbridled passions. Further, not only do we have this red-hot blood within us, but our lives are condemned to be slaves serving these rather unpleasant gods. So here's the theology of the Enuma Elish. God's immanent and volatile, powerful and capricious, emotional and self-centered. And the cosmology, it's a negative place where it was made unintentionally and brutally. And the DNA of the world is one of chaos and competition. Well, so for we as human beings, we're negatively portrayed as well. We're simply slaves to the kings, and we have this tendency to rivalry because we got this Kingju blood within us. And so therefore, how do you make your way in the world? Well, your moral theory is power's good, evil's weakness. The human task, avoid the God's wrath and just try to self-preserve. Well, that might seem like a rather discouraging story, but it does have explanatory power. It could be convincing. So, what happens in this context? The Jewish people say, that's not the world we believe in. Even though we're sitting here in exile, we will not capitulate to that worldview. And so they tell their story. Notice the contrast that we see in Genesis 1 to the Enuma Elish. This is a story about how God deliberately and methodically and intentionally created the world. Notice it starts off in this way. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss, while a mighty wind swept over the waters. Oftentimes, this is described as God creating ex nihilo, out of nothing, and yet the story clearly states that water already exists. This chaotic water, this Tiamat water, if you will, was there. But notice what God does with it. The first thing he does is separate the light from the darkness. Then he takes these primordial waters and he separates the waters from above from the waters from below, using a dome to keep them in their separate spheres. Then God starts working in the area below by pulling the water away from the land. It doesn't say he creates the land. He separates the land from the water, as if the land was already there. For 3 days, God then separates things, putting them in their proper place by establishing the created order that can work, that's tov, it's sufficient, that masters chaos, that establishes the created order. So he creates the different kinds of vegetation as well. So 3 days, he creates space. Then on the fourth, through the sixth day, he starts populating that space that he has created. So on the fourth day, still employing this repetitive fourfold pattern for each day, God populates the firmament with the sun and the moon and the planet and the stars. On the fifth day, he fills the waters with the fish and the sky from above with the birds. And finally, on the sixth day, he populates the land with animals and human beings. Notice a couple of things about this human. First, the text says that God created the human in the divine image. God created the human. Male and female, God created them. Now, in this version of creation, the male and female are made simultaneously. It's not that the male came first. Rather, it's Adam, which simply means in Hebrew, human being. The human comes in two varieties in this story, male and female. Further, we are made in the image of God, which is different from other animals. The Hebrew word image was often used as the name for the stakes that the king was placed, these stelas at the border of their kingdom. So that when you saw this image, the stake, you knew you were entering the kingdom's domain, the king's domain. So we are not only marked out, so we not only mark out that all the world is God's domain, because we're the image of God, but we are commissioned to maintain the world's order. For the text says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the seas and the birds of the air and all living things that move on the earth." And so he gives humans dominion over plants. We humans are not God's slaves, but rather we are put in charge. We have a special role in maintaining this divinely established order in the world. And in this scene, we are co-creators with God. For if we fail the job of maintaining the order that God has established, then that is when the chaos rears its ugly head again. Tov can be overcome when things aren't kept in proper place, proper order. When the divinely planned order is somehow ignored or creation is allowed to creep back into chaos, then evil returns. So maintaining goodness in this world requires real work and effort by human beings. It's not automatic. This is a very different story from what we see in the Enuma Elish. In the Babylonian myth, the world is one of chaos and evil where we can only experience disaster and despair as God's slaves. In contrast, Genesis 1 says that God created by putting things in a specific order so that there is room for created things, for life to flourish. This God shows this mastery over chaos by ordering it. And he gives us human beings a job in maintaining this order. So this tells us that we believe in a God who's transcendent. You notice he sort of creates from a distance. He's powerful. He commands just through words. And he's good because we can see by his actions that he's creating this order, this tov in and of itself. He must be an orderly God too, then, if he creates that way. And the view of the world is very positive. It works. It's sufficient. Not only that, it's orderly. It's purposeful. Because there's this repetitive pattern that tells us that, and the intentional methodical process God uses. But evil does lurk just underneath the surface, so that order is somewhat tenuous. So therefore, the human person, positive world view of this human person. We are made in the divine image and likeness, and there's a complementary nature between the genders, male and female. Together they're better, kind of thing. And then also, in terms of how we're to act, well, maintain order. That's what is good. Disorder is evil. So our task is to maintain that divine order. All right. With that, we'll end our talk on Genesis 1. And in the next video, we'll take a look at Genesis 2 and 3, a different creation story with a different focus.